Rio de Janeiro, Olympic officials announced on Thursday night that 271 Russian athletes had been approved to compete in the Rio Games, 118 fewer than the country had hoped to enter. But with less than 24 hours until the opening ceremony, the matter remained in question. Soon before the International Olympic Committee's announcement, an appeals court issued a ruling in favor of two Russian athletes that seemed to undercut the officials' case against their delegation. The Olympic Committee's exclusion of nearly a third of Russia's athletes for their ties to a government-sanctioned doping program was a blow to the integrity of the Games and will severely diminish Russia's presence across several sports in Rio. Still, Thursday's decision was far better for Russia than what many anti-doping officials had called for, a ban on its entire team. The International Olympic Committee said that it had consulted with top officials for the 28 sports participating in the Summer Games. Those officials had been asked to scrutinize the drug testing history of each Russian athlete. A panel appointed by the Olympic Committee approved the final Russian roster, the makeup of which had been uncertain until deliberations concerning wrestlers and swimmers concluded. If the Olympic Committee's ruling stands, Russia will now have a smaller delegation of athletes than 11 other countries, including Italy and Spain. Russia sent 436 athletes to the last Summer Olympics, in London in 2012. The United States has the largest number of athletes, 556, in Rio. Last-minute legal challenges to the Olympic Committee's decision are likely. In the wake of a doping scandal that implicated dozens of Russian athletes and government officials, Olympic officials had decided that Russian athletes hoping to compete in Rio should be presumed guilty and invited to present a case for innocence only if they had never before had a drug violation. The appeals court said Thursday that notion was unenforceable. Athletes who have been denied entry may still appeal to World Sports Arbitration Court, which is based in Switzerland but has established a satellite office in Rio for the Olympics and is prepared to adjudicate cases quickly. The on-site court's focus, however, is doping cases that arise at the Games rather than broader policy issues, and it is unclear how well equipped the operation may be for a flood of challenges to the eligibility decision. As recently as this week, the sports court issued verdicts on Russian athletes who had been barred for doping by their sports authorities. The court upheld the bans that track and field, rowing and weightlifting officials had imposed on Russian Olympic hopefuls. But other federations in other sports, such as boxing, had approved full rosters of athletes, leaving no need for appeals. The Olympic Committee's choices in disciplining Russia have been the subject of dispute and are likely to fuel debate for months to come as the authorities anticipate an overhaul of the anti-doping system. For clean athletes, I think the situation in Rio is tough to watch, said Travis Tygart, head of the United States Anti-Doping Agency. It's a mess, and Exhibit A of how truly incapable sport is of policing itself. Some athletes and anti-doping officials lobbied for what Thomas Bach, the Olympic Committee's president, referred to as the nuclear option, excluding Russia's entire team in a rebuke of its government's role in cheating schemes that corrupted the results of recent Olympics. This was a pervasive state-designed and operated system stretching across sports, said Richard W. Pound, a former president of the World Anti-Doping Agency and a former top Olympic Committee executive. At that point you have to say, you're showing such contempt for the rules of the game, we don't want you at the Olympics. Mr. Bach and fellow Olympic executives rejected that option, a decision Mr. Bach defended this week by saying he wanted to avoid the death and devastation it could have produced. Instead, Olympic officials reversed the basic principle of presuming athletes innocent until proven guilty. The difficult question we had to answer, Mr. Bach said Thursday, was, can you hold an individual responsible for the wrongdoing of his or her country? Last month, Olympic officials asked each sports governing body to make preliminary decisions that the IOC-appointed panel would review. They instructed the authorities to consider Russian athletes tainted by the state-run doping system unless their testing histories proved otherwise. Those instructions were not necessarily interpreted uniformly by the governing bodies of various sports, with some ratifying all Russian athletes within hours, as tennis did, and others deliberating for the past week and seeking further guidance. Alexander Zhukov, president of Russia's Olympic Committee, made a final plea to sports officials this week at an oceanside hotel in Rio. He expressed frustration that Russia's athletes were guilty by default. "Is this not discrimination?" he said. The evening before Olympic officials made their announcement, Mr. Zhukov rightly estimated that between 270 and 280 Russian athletes, roughly 70% of what Russia had planned for, would be cleared to compete. "It's a good question," he said, shrugging as he guessed. "Unfortunately, we lost our way."